Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the National Library of Australia and to one of the highlights of our events calendar, the Seymour Biography Lecture. I'm Marie-Louise Ayres, Director General of the National Library. I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nations people, the first Australians, as the traditional owners and custodians of this land, and give my respects to their elders, past and present, and through them to all Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Thank you for attending this event either in person or online, coming to you from the library on beautiful Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, with a beautiful language being awoken by dedicated community members. Darawinuna, Darawinunawal, Yangu Narawiri Dunamanyan, Nunawari, Darawari, Ningaradindi Wangarari Jinyin, which basically means we're all meeting here on Ngunnawal country. It's a particular pleasure to see so many of you here tonight for this year's Seymour Biography Lecture. Given the disruption to our major event activity over the last couple of years, due to, I think you all know what it's due to, and the very dedicated following that this lecture has had, it is simply wonderful to welcome so many of you back to the library. The Seymour Biography Lecture is named in honour of John and Heather Seymour, who are both with us this evening, and without whose support this lecture would simply not be possible. The first Seymour Biography Lecture was held in 2005, and since 2009 the National Library has been very proud to be its home. John and Heather are passionate supporters of the National Library and also the literary forms that we call biography, autobiography and memoir. Many of us share their passion. John and Heather have chosen to express their interest in life writing through their support for the lecture, and for many years now, the Seymours have also supported a summer scholarship in biography as part of the library's fellowship program for younger scholars, and in so doing, they are helping to develop the life writers of the future. So Heather and John, to both of you, thank you so much for all that you do for us and for the community. Now, past Seymour lecturers, and if you think back, started in 2005, we've been fortunate to have quite a few, form an honour roll of great life writers, and tonight's speaker is a fitting addition. Jacqueline Kent is a writer of biography and other non-fiction. Training initially as a journalist and broadcaster with the ABC in Sydney, Jacqueline has also written fiction for young adult audiences, worked as an editor and taught creative writing. And whoever's phone it is, you might want to just turn that one off, and anybody else, you might want to just check they're on silent. There's always one. Jacqueline's works of biography and memoir are numerous and significant. A Certain Style on influential book editor Beatrice Davis won the National Biography Award in 2002, and in 2008 she published An Exacting Heart, the story of musician and social activist Hephzibar Menuen. And in fact, very deep in our collections, we actually have some Menuen material. You've probably already seen or know about it. Jacqueline has written not one, but two biographies of Julia Gillard. The Making of Julia Gillard was published just before her Prime Ministership, and Take Your Best Shot was just after. The writing of both books and the two different portraits that they created must surely have been one of the most fascinating journeys that a biographer could take. Jacqueline's memoir, Beyond Words, A Year with Kenneth Cook, was shortlisted for the National Biography Award in 2020. And in that same year, her most recent book, Bada, A Woman for Our Time, on an iconic Australian suffragist, Vida Goldstein, was published in 2020. So please join me in welcoming Jacqueline Kent to present the 2022 Seymour Biography Lecture.
How's that? Can you all hear? Yeah. Thank you, Marie-Louise. That was a lovely introduction. And thanks also, of course, to the National Library, and particularly for John and Heather Seymour, whom I have only just met, and was delighted to be their guest at dinner last night. That it is an amazingly good thing, this, and thank you once again. Right. And of course it's a particular pleasure to be here because of the COVID thing. This has been going to happen for at least, I think, 2 years, And, numerous, like everybody else's life, it's all been postponed and rejigged and we'll do it again and, hasn't happened. So it is a particular pleasure to be here speaking to you all. Now, the thing is, when you start off talking about biography, because it's such a sort of an important kind of word, it's kind of a thing, you start thinking that you should start talking about great biographers of the past, like maybe, Tacitus or Suetonius or, Boswell's Johnson or even Lytton Strachey, eminent Victorians. And you can get embalmed in that sort of thing. So I've decided not to do any of that tonight. And what I want to do is lower the tone considerably and talk to you about, of all people, Donald Rumsfeld. You may, yes. Well, not talk about Donald Rumsfeld, actually, but start off by mentioning him because really, the thing that people remember about Donald Rumsfeld, who was, of course, the US Secretary of Defence in the George W. Bush administration, the thing about him was his ill-advised. He thought it was ill-advised. It's actually really sensible. His comment, he was speaking at a briefing about the lack of evidence that linked the government of Iraq with supplying weapons of mass destruction. In 2002, this was. And whether they were providing them to terrorist groups. And what he said was, and this is exactly what he said, as we know, don't you love as we know? As we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know that there are known unknowns. You've got to keep this fairly slow because it's kind of a bit vertiginous if you keep doing it quickly. We also know that there are known unknowns, and that is to say, we know there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know. Now, when you think about it, that's actually quite sensible. And it also goes in another way. It goes with another quote, which I'm quite fond of, which was by one of Abraham Lincoln's favourite humourists, a guy called Artemus Ward. And he said he was one of those homespun, backwoods humourists of the 19th century in America. And what he said was, it ain't what you don't know that hurts you, it's what you do know that ain't so. And I think all those comments are very worthwhile bearing in mind when you're talking about biography. And I think it's slightly unfair that Donald Rumsfeld was pilloried, or ridiculed rather, for saying those things about known unknowns and But what I'd like to do tonight is to go through what Donald Rumsfeld said and sort of evaluate it in terms of writing and researching biography. And because they're the bits of biography I know best, I'll be mostly talking about my own work, I think. So this is how it'll pan out, I hope. Okay, well, in the last 20-odd years, I've been writing the life stories of notable women. It's interesting that they just happen to be women. I just thought that was most interesting. Trying to set the course of their lives against their times, to explain the pressures of various kinds that led them to do what they did, and possibly to challenge others' expectations of them, which is the bit that I always find most interesting, actually. So this is where the Rumsfeld effect, if you can call it that, comes into operation. Because it's what do we know? What do we or don't we know? What can we or can't we know about the lives of our fellow humans if we want to write biography? So I'd like to spend a bit of time going through the criteria, just looking at them and examining them in the light of, well, basically my own work. Right. Well, first of all, the easy one, which is what you know about a subject for biography. What you know is usually, or most often, the reason most people decide why they want to spend their lives examining their time examining the lives of their subject. Maybe it's probably a series of facts that you find intriguing that you think need to be examined further or haven't been given their due, or else there's a central mystery in this person's life that you really want to tease out. And I have to say that we'll get to this later, but the central mystery is the very interesting one for a biographer, and I'm sure most people who write biography would agree with that. What made them do it? Why did they do it? Why were they there? What did they think they were doing? And what did they think they were doing is also a great way of being exasperated. What on earth what they think they were doing. But you do need to try and find out the reason for these things. And I think there are lots of reasons why people choose biography, but choose subject for biography. And one of them, of course, is because the person is worthy, because they're a famous person, they are worthy of having their lives memorialised, to which point I might tell you a story about a very well-known Australian, very celebrated Australian biographer who was asked by his editor to write the life story of a particular well-known Australian politician with whom he did not feel aligned. He did not feel that this was a congenial subject. And the editor sort of said, oh, look, come on, no one's done it. You've got to do it. It's, zeitgeist, something, blah and blah. And he said, I've done a lot of work like this. I know how long biography takes, and I am not having that little in my head for 5 years. And one can sympathise seriously, because a lot of people write biographies and about halfway through them they think, I don't really like this person, I really want to stop. By which time it's like that bit in Macbeth, you're as far gone in, you're so far gone in that you can't extract yourself. So that's always difficult. But for me, the reason for getting onto a biography subject, it's always personal for me, because my first biography, full biography, which was of Beatrice Davis, the well-known Angus and Robertson book editor from 1937 to 1973, was that I didn't know her well. I mean, I started out as a baby editor, and Beatrice was kind of the grande dame, and I mean both those words very seriously. She was very grande and she was very dame. And she really was, we're all terrified of her, at the same time as resenting her, because we were the next generation along and we knew more about her than she did, and so on and so forth, and there were all these people coming up, and the Helen Garners, the Kate Grenvilles, people who were not wrote the kinds of books that Beatrice Davis was at all sympathetically disposed towards. But I decided it'd be good to memorialise, or to write a book about her, for several reasons. One is that publishing anyone who's been involved in book publishing knows that it is an absolutely mad industry. It gets written about as if it's some kind of, tablets of stone thing, but it's not. When you think of the extreme difference in the personalities involved, both the people who write books, the people who publish them, and the mad things that happen, and trust me, there are a lot. I thought, why hasn't anyone written a book about publishing, saying what fun it is, apart from everything else, and what fun these people are, and what reserves of tact, human kindness and sheer keeping your temper sometimes you have to have if you're working as an editor. And I thought, well, Beatrice knows an awful lot about that. And I'd done her job. I'd been an editor, so I'd read a lot of her correspondence, which is in the Mitchell in Sydney. And, the Angus and Robertson archives are a glory to behold. They really are wonderful. They've got everything in them. It's a sort of archive where people kept theatre tickets and bus tickets, the sort you really love, the sort you really want to look at. But but because I knew her job, and I'd been seeing the letters that she wrote, and I could tell fairly well quite often how clenched the teeth were occasionally, how happy she was about somebody's success, how well she got on with her writers, how sympathetic she was towards them, and how cranky she could be, because she's a pretty multifaceted creature. But I really thought that really someone doing a job in an industry unlike any other, and because I'd worked with other people's words, I did want to give my profession, as it was then, its due. And so, you know, books about publishing can be so dull. So that was the reason. That was the reason for writing about Beatrice, and it was good because I could read a lot between the lines with that, and it was interesting to see things like the way editing was done then and so on and so forth, when nowadays, of course, you can go straight from having an idea for a book to print without going anywhere near paper, which is really something to think about. Proofs on screen, proofreaders read proofs on screen, people do corrections on the screen, they do all of that. It's almost completely non-paper now. So the other reason for doing that was to keep a record of an industry that was changing very fast and is changing even more now. So that was that one. The second one was about Hephzibar Menuen, who was the sister of Yehudi Menuen, violinist, of a name that's not known much now for anybody over 40, because there's the Nigel Kennedys, there are all these violinists who've come up, and the celebrity pianist, the celebrity musician is much more a creature of music now than it was when Yehudi and Hephzibar were absolutely it at the time. This was in the 30s and 40s and up to the 50s. And they were rock stars. And Hephzibar was particularly interesting because the Menuen family, the three of them, there were 2 girls and a boy, the 3 of them had enormously precocious musical talent. They were all child prodigies, the 3 of them. And I happen to come from a family where precocious intelligence is wildly overvalued. I will not go into details, but I've got a few fairly dodgy relatives on one side in particular, and who did fairly dodgy things. That but he hasn't. They're bright. Oh, we mustn't say that because he's got an IQ of 160 or something like that. And so I've always been a bit interested, for personal reasons, about what happens to people who show precocious talent very early, whether they crash and burn, whether they learn to catch up all the things that most of us learn as teenagers, and most of us have to learn through life just through sort of being out there and being thumped, basically. Hephzibar and Yehudi weren't. They were never sent to school. They were hothoused into being stars, really. And so the thing is that my father also happened to see Yehudi and Hephzibar when he was young, and Yehudi Menuen was the greatest violinist the world has ever known, as far as my father was concerned. And Hephzibar, was a very good pianist. He was actually quite interesting because she was sort of playing the second part. I was going to say second fiddle, but that's terrible. She was playing the subordinate part to him. And she was never, as far as my father was concerned, she was never subordinate. She was a talent in her own right. So I thought she was well worth examining. Not least also because of what she did with her life. Now, I don't know whether those of you who read the book would know that she got married at 17, and she married a rich grazier called Lindsay Nicholas, who lived in the Western District of Victoria. And she gave up. She was about to have, the following year, she was ready to play at Carnegie Hall. And she gave that up to marry Lindsay because she was 17, and she'd just been playing the piano since she was 3, and she was really sick of it, and she wanted to discover life. Well, she did, but the problem was that the life that she discovered wasn't exactly the life. She sort of thought it'd be like Europe only with sheep. It was going to be very different. And she did quite a lot during and after the war. She had 2 kids, and then in the mid-50s, she gave it all up and went to England. She left her husband and 2 children, 2 boys, aged 11 and 9, and went off and married somebody else. She married a guy called Richard Hauser, whose daughter, by the way, was Eva Cox, whom some of you may know, yes. And so that was we were talking about earlier before about the mysteries of life. That was the one I wanted to try and work out. What leads a woman to do that? And I don't know whether I was very angry with her at the end because I thought, because she really did hurt a very large number of people, and she had because of her background, because of who she was a bit of a kid actually, she had no idea what she had done to those other people. And I thought, anyway, so that was the second one. And also that whole thing about being a special person. Who did she have to prove her specialness to, and why? And all those questions come together in her story. And the third one, of course, was the biography of Julia Gillard was not really in the same category as either of those two. It was in about 2009, I think, when she was deputy DPM, which is deputy PM to Kevin Rudd. She was getting a lot of publicity, and it was suggested to me that she might be a good subject for biography. And I thought, well, yeah, I mean, she's the first person who's got this far, so let's have a look. And I wanted to see what drove her and how what were the steps in her becoming Australia's first woman deputy prime minister, and afterwards, of course, in about May 1910, becoming Australia's first woman prime minister. Gosh, I remember that night when she deposed Kevin Rudd. It was a Wednesday night, it was freezing cold in winter, and I remember yelling at the television, "Julia, no, it won't be good. It'll be good, It was going to be, and of course the mystery in her life there was what led her to, as the deputy, because, people say, oh, well, there are these fights going on, but she was the deputy. What led her to do that? And that was the thing in her life that I wanted to try and elucidate. Now, the thing about the Julia Gillard one too, of course, is the story isn't finished yet, and she's gone on, after 2013, she has gone on to have an extraordinary stellar career as a public institute person. And the other thing that she's done with enormous dignity, as she has not got herself involved in Australian politics. She's the only one of the ones who hasn't in the last, forever actually, when you think about it. I mean, even you get Keating weighing in every now and again too now, these days. But, yeah, what was that? Having the self-discipline and the self-respect to be able to do that is pretty big, pretty good, I think. But her story, of course, isn't finished. So I'd like to revisit that one, but it'll have to wait for a while, I think, because that's the only subject I've had so far who's been alive when I've been writing about her. And I mentioned this to her in an unguarded moment, and she said, "I'm not crossing the road with you," which is reasonable enough. But, that whole thing about being guarded, we saw it on television again and again. It's exactly the same, I think, unless you know her, and I didn't. I was coming from outside. I wasn't a friend. I wasn't part of the Byzantine, God help us, Victorian Labor Party. I didn't have the connections. I didn't have the history. So she was understandably very guarded, and it was okay, but it was a bit frustrating from that point of view. But she was really good. I met her a few times, and I became very fond of her in not in any particular close way, because she doesn't offer friendship at all. She offers friendliness without friendship, and that's a sort of modus operandi. I suspect Albanese is a bit like that too. I think that you have to. You can't get, you've got to keep the perspex between you and the rest of the world, I think. But it's not great for a biographer, I can tell you. But anyway, but Vida Goldstein, which is the one after that, that was much easier in a way, because first of all she had died in the 1930s, and no, later than that, 46, I think. Anyway, she died, and the great saving grace of her was that she didn't have a family, which is one of the things, as a biographer, I mean, I know that, I think it was Brenda Nile, I think someone told me last night, that she talked about having to get on side with the descendants. Yeah, and it's very important, and it's often not possible. But anyway, being how she was the first woman to put her hand up for the federal parliament anywhere in the Western world, in Victoria in 1903, that had a strong personal element to me too, because many years ago when I was a student at, I just finished being a student, I was about 19, I think, I had a friend called Diane Scott, who was the first woman I'd ever met she'd done a history thesis at Sydney University about Australian suffragettes or suffragists. And I hadn't known there were any. I hadn't heard of Rose Scott, and I hadn't heard of Vida, and I hadn't heard of any of them. But Diane told me about them, and it just kind of lodged in the back of my head. And I thought, she again had been written about in a rather worshipful way. So I thought it would be really good to look at that struggle and look at all the women, because it wasn't just her, there were heaps of women who were out there on the hustings, and there were some very brave women doing that work, and they had to put up with, a great deal. And so, it was fascinating to hear about her. So I've dedicated Vida to Diane because I'm extremely grateful to her. Unfortunately, she died 2 or 3 years ago in Japan, so that makes it even sadder. She never saw the book, which I'm very sad about, but it's there. So there we are. Okay, well, that's the known knowns, but you get to the known unknowns, and that's the things where you have to find out. And this is, you're always looking for details that illuminate a subject. I'll get onto that a bit later because it's very important. It can be pretty disheartening when you're interviewing people. I'm sure people have had this experience. You go to find someone who insists that she's the best friend of the person you are writing about and knows every single thing about them, and you think, oh, good, spill the beans, great stuff. And with Hephzibar in particular, there were people, and with Beatrice to some extent also, there were people who told you stuff you already knew. Yeah, I knew she got married. Yes, I knew she got married. I knew she married Freddie British. And I knew she edited this book, and I knew she edited that book, and I knew all that. But they were presenting it as if no one had ever told them this before. Now, that's interesting in itself, really, because what that says is that in Hephzibar's case in particular, she's dazzled, they're kind of dazzled by her, and anything, they're happy to have her as a friend. She's glamorous. And so anything that she chooses to tell them, and she's got the way of saying, well, I'm telling you and only you. So some people have the ability to be very, very confidential. And I think that was Hephzibar, but wasted a lot of time. But anyway, that's how it is. And one of the big blank spots in the story of Hephzibar, which I really had trouble with, was about the divorce, the events surrounding the divorce, because, as I said, she met and married Lindsay Nicholas and fled in her 20s. And abandon everybody. And the whole thing caused a terrible scandal, as you can imagine, because the parents thought that they'd got her happily settled, and there she was in Australia, and she was bringing up healthy children, and that was all fine. But when she did that, they were furious. They were absolutely ropeable. And I didn't have any information from them. I didn't have any correspondence from them or anything at all about that time. I mean, I could have pasted over the cracks. There are always ways of doing that, but you never feel happy doing that. You really don't. And anyway, so I visited Hephzibar's, when I was in London researching the book, I visited Zamira, who is Hephzibar's niece, Yehudi's eldest daughter. And I said something about what a difficult life she must have had herself, because she was married, she was the daughter of Nola, who was Yehudi's first wife. And it wasn't a happy marriage. I just said something, anodyne and, sympathetic biographer-y, about how it must have been so hard. And she just looked at me and said, just a minute. And she went away and she went into another room and she came back with a pile of paper. I swear it was that high. And she said, here. And I said, oh, well, what's that? And she said, these are all the letters that Hephzibar wrote to her parents and that her parents wrote to her around the time, in 1953 and 1954, around the time of the divorce and the separation. I thought, oh my God. I said, how did you get those? And she said, Moshe, her grandfather, this tells you a fair bit about him, he kept carbon copies of every letter he wrote. Don't you love people like that? But he did. He just did. He wanted to keep a record. And he kept all her letters. And when he died, he handed them over to his eldest grandchild, who happened to be Zamira, who had kept them ever since. Hadn't given them to a library, hadn't given them back to the family. She had them in a spare room. And I just sort of went, look, I said, look, I've got my computer here. I'll sit in the back room and I'll come every day and I'll type it all out and I'll be terribly careful. And she said, oh, no, don't have to do that. Just take them away. I thought, what did you... So there was I getting on the tube at Paddington with it was Waitrose plastic bag in my right hand containing this amazing cache of letters. And of course, I spent a fortune on photocopying, of course I did, and then handed them all back. But without that, I would not have been able to complete the book. It's the greatest stroke of luck I think I've ever had as a biographer, and it just happened completely out of the blue. And that's the weird thing about biography on any level, the weird things that happen to you and the things you find out. And those were good letters too. They were written, I quoted them extensively in the book, and she didn't want to read. She didn't want to read the book when I'd finished it. She just said, "Oh no, this is all right." She believed, I think, it was some kind of family duty. It was quite something. Anyway, the thing was that they were written at white heat, those letters, by two very angry people, and it was really good to have them. Really good to have them. And one of the bits about writing biography, too, this we're getting to the third of the Rumsfelds, is the bit that Rumsfeld left out, which is the unknown knowns, which is the things you didn't realise you knew, and the little things you can put together in your own head, and this happens a lot with biography as well. It happened a lot with Beatrice Davis because I knew her background and the stories of her authors, and I'd done her job. But the most interesting example, I think, of this was Beyond Words, which was the memoir I wrote about my marriage to Kenneth Cook. And he, the author of Wake in Fright, I married him several months before he died in 1987. There were the reasons I married him. I didn't want to marry him. He wanted to marry me, but I wasn't all that keen on it. But I thought, I suppose, you'll do it once. So better to marry than burn, all that stuff, So, but the thing is, he wrote about 10 novels and scripts and radio plays and talks and stage plays. He has an enormously large body of work. But he's most famous for Wake in Fright, of course, published in 1961. And that movie, by the way, is an absolute shot list for the book. It really is. You could just about take that book and write a film script from it, scene by scene. It's really so visual. But it's very interesting. He only wrote. He always sort of said, early 30s. He wrote his first book, his first and biggest success, and he always said that it was a young man's book. He'd learned a lot since he wrote it, and everybody talks about that. But I've done better stuff since. The way writers always do say things like that. But it always puzzled me a lot because when I read it, the subject matter's pretty bleak, as most of you know, and particularly for the novel, the subject matter's really bleak, and the landscape's a bit, ordinary. But the tone of the work's what's interesting. It's got a slightly jocular. Let's have another look at it. It's got a slightly jocular tone. The book does. It's not sort of grim and spare at all. It's got a sort of tone about who are these people and why do they drink so much? For goodness sake, who are they? What are they doing? And do you know the books that it struck me most like? And this is really weird. And this is the joining of the dots. You're going to be really surprised. They're a Weird Mob by Nino Carlotta, by John O'Grady. It's the same story. If you look at it, strange person comes along to new society of which he knows nothing, is thrown into at deep end, has to make sense. I mean, of course, one is played for comedy and Wake and Fright isn't precisely played for comedy, but it's the same story. And that had been written, I checked it out, and that book was written, published about 1957, and Wake and Fright was only 4 years later, and he had about 2 or 3 goes writing it. I think something lodged in the brain there. I really do. And so that was the sort of the weird little synapse there. I would never have said that. I came upon that little gem sometime after Ken had died, so, you know, he would have sort of said, oh, whatever floats your boat or something like that. He would have been very dismissive of such view. But anyway, and in fact, if you look at his other novels, he wrote a novel called The Wine, with a ridiculous title, The Wine of God's Anger, which is about a young conscript in Vietnam. Same story. Young conscript, wide-eyed, young, good Catholic lad in this case, goes... It's one of Australia's very few, in fact, I think possibly the only full-length Australian anti-Vietnam War novel. I mean, there have been books about it, but they've been mostly memoirs. I don't think anyone else wrote... I may be wrong, but I don't think that anybody else wrote. But it's the same story. And of course, it's a fairly common story. I mean, really, it is. You know, wide-eyed young man goes to find life and finds it more difficult than he thought. I mean, it's a tried and true one, but it's something that he used twice, and I thought it was quite interesting. Anyway, so if anybody wants to write a thesis about the links between They're a Weird Mob and the Word of Kenneth Crook, feel free. There it is. But the worst of it is, of course, and we're getting to the serious end, is the unknown unknowns. And they're the worst. I mean, everyone will tell you that. They really are. The bits that you find out when it's 10 minutes into print, or you never find out at all, or the words that you can't, or the little connections you just cannot possibly make. It's very frustrating. And you often find things out when it's too late. To which point, I would like to read you one of my favourite quotes from a New Yorker writer called Louis Menand. In 2003, he wrote, "When you undertake historical research," and it also applies to biography, "two truths that seem banal come to seem profound. The first is that your knowledge of the past, apart from occasionally a limited visual record and the odd unreliable survivor, comes entirely from written documents. You are almost completely cut off by a wall of print from the life you have set out to represent. You can't know most of what has not been written about. What has been written about therefore takes on an importance that may be spurious." That is so true, because it's the only thing you've got to make a heap out of it. A few lines in a memoir, a snatch of recorded conversation, a letter fortuitously preserved, an event noted in a diary, all become luminous with significance, even though they are merely the bits that have floated to the surface. The historian, biographer, clings to them while somewhere below the huge submerged wreck of the past of the person you're writing about sinks slowly out of sight. And there's a lot of truth in that. How can you know someone anyway, it's a bit distant. What you can't do is make stuff up. And this is what people have done. You may know the story of... Anyone know the story of Edmund Morris? Edmund Morris was given the job of writing the first authorised biography of Ronald Reagan. He found out so little, he said, from Reagan and those who knew him, that he abandoned a straight biography and turned the book into a sort of hybrid novel. He invented characters who never existed, It's scenes in which they interact with real people and other scenes that were dramatised or made up. He even invented sources and footnotes. I mean, seriously, this is big-time stuff. He called the book Dutch. The book was published in 1999 after 14 years of work. And I mean, okay, but you can imagine how desperate he must have felt knowing that he'd got all this money, because he got a lot of money to write this, and it's hanging over him, and he didn't have a book. That he couldn't write it he was being paid to write more than just, New York Times cuts. And so he didn't have it. So you have to sympathise with him to some extent. But when it was finished, the problem was that when it was finished, it was presented to the public as if it was a proper researched biography. Now I reckon that was the really big mistake, because without getting too po-faced about this, you've got a certain contract between writer and reader. And as a biographer, the reader's got to believe that you've done your work and you know what you're saying, and that what you're saying is, as far as you can judge, true. And if you don't know it is or it isn't, this is something that I keep telling younger writers about. You're allowed to speculate, provided you flag that you don't know, but it could be because of this, it could be because of that. The balance of probability is that it's this, but we do not know because of X. I mean, it's a little frustrating, but it's a hell of a lot better than presenting fiction as fact, I think. And I mean, I know, there's all the hybrid stuff. There's the Crown, for heaven's sake, and I've got no great quarrel with the Crown. And, the conversations that may or may not have taken place and probably didn't. But that's never been presented as absolute documentary fact. That's been as... and I think that's okay. But the New York Times had such trouble with it. They just said... a 1990 review in the New York Times said, "A reader who surrenders to Morris's self-indulgent blend of scholarship and imagination will be led through a riveting story to a transcendent conclusion with a surprise twist. If there is a, quote, higher truth, unquote, justifying the book's technique, it is that Ronald Reagan lived in a world of his own fictions, far more extensive than the fictions of Edmund Morris. Who better suited to plumb a phantom subject than a phantom narrator? Sorry, don't buy it. No. And in fact, as far as I know, that book did not sell its socks off, and neither it should. Anyway, I'd like to just go into it's 1:45. I'd just like to sort of mention a couple of other things that when I was thinking about this, I was just thinking of certain details about the subjects that I've dealt with and how small incidents about who they were, things that I just found out that were usually things that went past and nobody, or real depth charges. They really were told you a lot about the person without them knowing, and and gave you a new illumination about their characters. I'd just like to mention a few of them. In the early 1990s, I helped Lindy Chamberlain write her autobiography. This is before I started writing biography of my own. And that was an assignment and a half, I can tell you. But anyway, I spoke to her about, it was 1993, I think, 92, 93. Anyway, it was 10 or 12 years after the baby had been taken. Now, what she told me two things that I wish, in a way, had come out at the time, but they didn't. And the first one, in August 1980, she and her husband, Michael, went home to Cooranbong without their baby, with their two elder sons. And she described, this is really amazing, she described lying awake in bed at night in Cooranbong, which is surrounded by the Wattigan Mountains, and hearing dingoes howling to each other in the mountains. Imagine what that would have been like. And the other thing is, this is really, she told me, because she and Michael were broke and she wasn't producing enough milk. She was producing milk with no baby. So she had to take the baby formula back to the chemist and get a refund. Now, those two small facts tell you a great deal, I think. And with Beatrice, the thing I learned about her, which was interesting, when she was in 1937, she married a much older man, Frederick Bridges, and it was the time when, of course, women were not allowed, married women were not allowed to go, not allowed to work. So what did she do? She was working as Miss Davis at Angus and Robertson's, the wonderful Miss Davis, we all love her. She went up one lunch hour, only one lunch hour, 1 hour. She went to the registry office, took her wedding ring off, came back to work and didn't tell anybody. I think that was, I don't think she was alone there, actually. I've got a feeling that might have been a little less uncommon then. But it was very Beatrice. My private life is my private life and I'm not telling anybody about it. So I thought that was, besides which she wanted that job. She wanted to keep doing that job. So those two things were very sort of indicative. And with Hephzibar, it was her wedding photo. When she married Lindsay Nicholas, there's this photograph of her, and it's in the book. There's this photograph of her. He's putting the ring on her finger, and she's wearing the most ridiculous wedding dress. It's actually a poke bonnet. She's got one of those. She's wearing a crinoline, and she's wearing one of those high early 19th century bonnets. And I couldn't work out why. And the editor of that book, and I was thinking, mad, because Lindsay was just dressed sort of normal gear. And I finally worked out that she had, that Lindsay was a sheep farmer. She was being little Bo Peep. I couldn't believe, she's only 17. And that shows you how young she was. And needless to say, she found that life in Terranallum was a little different from that, and she wasn't going around with a little crook sort of. Anyway, so that was that. And the other thing that I found out about her, which was, and I've had this corroborated, not 24 hours ago actually, that when she couldn't get a piano and practice, what she did, she'd use the edge of a shelf or a table as a practice keyboard when she didn't have a. And a reviewer said, "Oh, that's ridiculous. Nobody's that good." But yes, that can happen. That has happened. People do that, and it was because she knew the repertoire so thoroughly from the age of 3 that she could hear the piece in her head even when she was going to play it. She and Hootie had played together so often they knew it. With Vida, it was her washing, because it really bugged me when she was running. 1903, she was wandering around Victoria. Speaking to town meetings, and she was always praised for being, never what she said, it was always how pretty she was and how ladylike, and funny that still happens, Julie Bishop's red shoes. Anyway, and she travelled everywhere by train, and it was really hot and dusty, and how on earth did she manage to look so good in that era? Who did her washing when she was travelling around Victoria with a tin trunk? So I did a bit of research and I found out that, first of all, she was staying with people, and the people she was staying with were pretty well-to-do because it was a very middle-class thing, and they had servants often in Victoria. They had people who did the washing and stuff. So if she was staying there for 2 or 3 days, they would do her washing for her if necessary. Also, there were railway hotels, but I can't imagine her really giving her precious petticoats to someone in a hotel. Also, of course, the point is that all the railway lines were radial from Melbourne, so she could go out and back. It wasn't that hard, so she could wait for her person at home, Lizzie McPherson, to do the necessary tidying. But, just imagine all that. It was hot, it was dusty, buttons, no zips till after World War II. Just really, really difficult stuff. And it's questions like that that drive you mad, actually. You just really want to know. I think with just one more thing, actually, one thing about Gillard. With her, I told you it was boilerplate all the way. She told me exactly, what, and then acting on information receipt, I sort of said, "So what was your first car?" And she said, "No one's ever asked me that before," in an accusing voice. And I said, "Well, what was it?" And I can't remember what it was now. I think it was a Cortina. And the interesting thing about it was that her parents bought it for her to go to Melbourne in. That tells you quite a lot about their parents. That tells you quite a lot that, you know, she always made a big deal about her parents were dirt poor and everything. They saved up enough money to get their eldest daughter a car to go to Melbourne in. No wonder she was so close to her family, which she always was. And that was just another little way of showing how close, the family closeness. So, you know, all these little things just turn up. You've got to be on the lookout for them, I think. But when you find them, they're the valuable. They're what make I think things like that are what make people come alive on the page if you can possibly do it. And I'd just like to finish by saying there's a very nice quote from the London Review of Books by Tom Crewe, and it's one of those we must remember things. It's a slightly pay attention class, but here we go. We must remember that the past is more unknown than known, that the vast majority of lived experience is penetrable only to the guided imagination. If we pursue the dead, it is because they have left so many clues behind, and because we can't help being curious as to what they looked like before they turned their backs. And if you're a biographer, you need to find out as much and as clearly as you possibly can, however long it takes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jacqueline. And, you know, we've got lots to think about in terms of obviously known and unknown. But in fact, that last quote is amazing in terms about what you're trying to do, you know, before they turn their backs. It's kind of wonderful. You've also, of course, talked about the role of luck. And that stroke of luck you had, I think, that was, you know, pretty special. And you will know that many biographers toil and actually that smoking gun they never find, which is really quite difficult. So all of these things come together, and together with those little kind of details that might give you a tiny little a key into what might otherwise be an impenetrable kind of surface, I think. And knowing what that key is, I'm sure, is something that the biographer's imagination has to find over time as well, yes, and not exceed it by making up citations. Goodness me, that's very naughty. So thanks, Jacqueline, for a really fantastic lecture. I'm very intrigued, and I'll get a chance to talk to you about this later on, about the fact that your subjects are women, and of course you will know that women tend not to leave papers behind. Either they or somebody else think it's not important enough. And there are so many important women for whom it's very, very hard to tell these stories because they're like a ghost. And you have to tell their story from the outside in, but not with these women, which is fantastic. Now, we do have some time for some questions this evening. The presentation is being live streamed, so those who are regulars know the routine. Please wait till the microphone gets to you, or the people at home won't be able to hear you. And we've got folks on both sides here, so if you've got a question, put it up. Oh, there we go. We've got two over here straight away, so we'll go one and then two. Got you up there. Okay.
Thank you so much for your talk. I had a kind of pointed question about biography, but I want to make some. I don't want to ask that question. I want to just play on some of the wonderful concepts that you gave us about known and unknowable. The last time I heard anybody quote that Rumsfeld thing, it was at an academic conference by a young academic. It was so dismissive. So it's nice to hear, it's so refreshing to hear this. But I was thinking about, as you were talking, and I guess my question is, do you agree with this? As biographers, there's what we know. We find it out, and we know it. And then there's what the public does not know. And I think that the meeting point of that, or one of the key meeting points, is a word you used, and one that gave Morris so much trouble. And you brilliantly exposed him, by the way. And that word is multifaceted. What we find out and we know about our subjects is they're all, in one form or another, I think, multifaceted. And yet, if you've got members of the public, especially like I do U.S. presidents and U.S. politicians, and you do Australian politicians.
Reagan, yes.
Right. So they often will have a very almost caricaturish view of people who, they don't think of them as being complex. They're either good or bad or whatever. They support them or they don't. And that our mission here is to show the multifacetedness of almost of all of these figures. And so Morris's problem, as you're kind of weighing that, it was that he went looking for a multifaceted Reagan, and he couldn't find him. He found a simplistic, unreflective person. Why? Because his earlier subject was Theodore Roosevelt, who was infinitely intellectual. And I think that was his problem. But everything you said about, I've read that book. That is a frustrating book.
Yes. This is the biography, alleged biography, in case you need, this is the alleged biography of Ronald Reagan. And in fact, you can always say with Virginia Woolf that we're all composed of many selves, but I reckon that's a cop-out. I reckon it is, and I think you probably do too. Yeah.
Thank you, Jackie. That was really lovely. My question is, biography seems to be a form of inhabitation. You sort of trying to step into a person's mind.
Yep.
And after doing that for so long, how do you shrug that person off? How do you exorcise them from your own mind? Do they stay with you forever?
Well, they do a bit. Like that comment about the well-known biographer who wasn't going to have this politician in his head for 5 years. In fact, they do. And they not only that, but it's kind of a process of finding out. It's like a gunpowder trail, your little fizzes coming along. You can't ever possibly know. You cannot possibly know them as well as you think you do. But what you have to do is, I think, look for empathy, something that you can relate to. I mean, I know this sounds simplistic, but it's true. Something that you can understand, even though when there's a person whose life you don't understand and is completely different from your own. I mean, we've all been angry, we've all been frustrated, we've all been furious, we've all had all these feelings. It's trying to, well, it's not inhabitation, it's slightly projection too, I suppose. Projecting, how you would feel about this. Or, okay, she felt really angry about this. How did she express it? Well, she went and gave him a piece of her mind. Oh, I wouldn't have done that, but good on her for doing that. That kind of thing. You go from the impulses as well as you can find them, I think. Because they've got to become alive. I mean, it's not they did this, they did that. I mean, that's the whole point of this thing, bringing people to life on the page. It's not unlike fiction at all in that respect. It really isn't. So, yeah.
Jacqueline, thanks very much. My question is something is on the subject that you alluded to early on and then put aside. You said how important it was to get families or descendants support. Can you talk about things that you just omitted from biographies because you couldn't get their support, or biographies you didn't pursue because you didn't think you'd be able to, or other authors that you know have faced this problem?
Oh, yes. Well, it's a big problem. It's a big problem for everybody. The problem always is with most people who aren't familiar with biography, and most people aren't, it's really flattering to have your aunt or your mother or your father or whoever is going to be the subject of a book. And you think, oh, then people will think... But the problem comes when the questions get a little bit too close to the bone. And that's really the problem. And that is the problem with the biographer. Because if the biographer you've got to put that stuff in. I mean... I know a very good friend of mine, actually, who she wrote a biography of the writer Randolph Stowe, and his family did not know that he was gay, didn't know he was gay at all, and so my friend had to, and it was actually said to her that members of the family did say that, if you say this is true, you're not going to get, the literary executive was not going to give permission for the book to be published. Now that's a pretty basic something or other about somebody's psyche, and basically she got around it, but she she didn't say, you can get around these things without sort of saying, yeah, I think in this case, basically what she talked about male friendships a lot. There was a lot more about male friendships in his poetry, and it just about squeezed through. She was lucky. She was lucky, but the family were very good. Most families are okay about doing this, but you have to be really careful. And in my case, with Hephzibar, her second husband, Richard Hauser, was not a particularly attractive human being. He had 2 daughters, and both of them, or the elder one in particular, Eva, told me some stuff about him that was really not particularly flattering. And I showed it to her before I published it, and she said, "You got it all completely wrong." And I thought, oh, great, yeah, thanks. You told me. I said, I didn't put down anything you didn't tell me. No, it's all wrong. You've got it all wrong. So I said, okay, well, tell me tell me where I've got it wrong. And so she didn't really, but I changed a few things. And her sister her half-sister was absolutely incandescent and sort of punished me on Amazon and wrote nasty reviews and did all that. Well, I have to say that I got to the end position of that fairly quickly and thought, all right, that's fine. You're not going to sue me? Good, that's okay. So you've got to be careful. You really do have to be careful. But I don't think you should omit things unless, well, I mean, with Ken Cook, he had 4 children, and I had problems with them, and they're in the book, but I didn't make a big deal of them because it was 30 years ago. And some of those children have not been happy afterwards. But I didn't put that in the book because it wasn't part of the story, So it would have been gratuitous. Had I been possibly slightly younger, I might have sort of thought, well, serve them, but I don't. You can't do that. It comes out really badly when you do that, and it's just not necessary. So if you can be lucky. I heard of somebody too who was doing the biography of an artist and wrote a lot about this artist and his first wife. And the second wife got really pissed off and refused to let her reproduce some of his work. You've got to be careful. Be nice to second wives is the other thing about that too. Yeah. Oh, it's a minefield. It is a minefield. Yeah.
Look, we've got time for one last question, and that's it, I'm afraid. So.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It is quite a quick, simple question. When you're interpreting the evidence that you find, whether you're interviewing people or you've dug things out of archives, you talk about instinct and interpreting things from your own point of view. Do you find the techniques or principles of psychology at all helpful?
Not particularly, because for one very good reason, I think. I mean, psychology, you're well, kind of, when you're doing this, you're dealing in psychology all the time, of course you are, but I don't find reading psychology particularly useful because of its generalised nature. I haven't found, I don't know, maybe I just haven't been reading properly, but I've never found that the academic pronouncements about people's psychology is helpful, because you've got about 437,000 other examples which are nothing to do with what you're writing about, and you can find so many rabbit holes, which is always a problem with biography anyway. You're always diving around rabbit holes, so you've got to keep your eye on the main game. So not particularly. I'm sure people who do use that, people like Janet Malcolm, for example, can do that, but I don't. It doesn't work so well for me. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, well, we're going to call the questions to a close because we have run out of time. But I hope you'll join us upstairs to enjoy a drink and some conversation. And Jacqueline's very kindly making herself available to sign some copies of her books that are for sale in our bookshop. And I think we'd also want to say thanks for a really... I'm going to have such good conversation over dinner later on, so that's fantastic. I've been on the other side, of course, of the of the reference desk, and I think I know some of those people you're talking about. The artist with the 2 wives, I'm pretty sure I know who you're talking about.
I think you do. Yeah.
But I just would also ask you to again thank Jacqueline for a great lecture, and thank John and Heather for making it possible for us to hear from people like Jacqueline. So thank you.